Bonjour, Ireland edition of Cas, and welcome to this production of Support Coach Television. Today's episode. This text will be attached to each of the first, second, and third read posts in your Google Classroom. The first read, you'll be focusing on summarizing information in the text. Your second read will focus on analyzing two different accounts. And the third read will focus on evaluating the text critically. In italics, you see that this biography is a fictional work about a made-up person that models the characteristics and text features common in authentic texts of this type. Biography is when you write about another person, and we know from last week that Edith Markham is a fictional person. So here goes our reading. It would be hard to overestimate Edith Markham's contributions to the long campaign for the rights of all citizens to vote. Markham became a vital and active supporter of voting rights for most of her long life. As a girl in the 1850s, Markham heard about the writings and speeches of former slaves who spoke out publicly for the end of slavery. Inspired by them, she pursued and attained an education, including a law degree. Markham was prepared to do great things. Early years. Markham was born into poverty in April or May 1845. Her first years were spent helping out in her father's blacksmith shop in New York City. She and her 5 siblings carried out a variety of tasks, but it was young Edith who performed the most unpleasant job of all. She collected payments on her father's bills. Perhaps Markham's father, Cyrus Peebles, had detected his youngest daughter's force of personality, or perhaps the sight of a 6-year-old appearing at the door and demanding payment was more than most clients could resist. In any event, young Edith was so successful at collecting the money owed that Cyrus decided his daughter would benefit from a life in better circumstances. Peebles sent the 8-year-old Edith to live with Thomas and Mina West and their 9-year-old daughter, Olivia. A contract that was signed that bound or indentured Edith to 7 years of service in the West household, after which she would receive a sum of money to start a business or learn a trade. Edith's primary responsibility was working as a maid who cleaned the West kitchen. She also served as a companion to Olivia. This no doubt is how Edith Markham got her early education. The two girls most likely studied together. This education was the bedrock for all of Markham's subsequent achievements. Markham completed her 7 years of indentured servitude and received the promised sum of cash. She knew exactly how she would spend it. Thomas West recorded in his diary that Markham told him, "Once you get a taste for education, you just keep wanting more." West helped arrange for her to attend Wentworth College, which had recently begun admitting free blacks. Edith Markham had decided to become a lawyer. Markham was inspired by the anti-slavery speeches and writing she read in the early 1860s. Certainly, she was a regular reader of William Lloyd Garrison's anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator. We know she met Garrison in 1872. It was the same year she passed her legal exams and became one of the first black female lawyers in the nation. Garrison was a lifelong opponent of slavery, and he kept careful records of everyone he met. While we can't know what he and Edith Markham discussed, it was very likely that Garrison urged her to help blacks freed after the Civil War to learn about their rights as citizens. Regardless of her sources of inspiration, we know that Markham failed to establish a practice in New York City and for a time took up residence in New Orleans, Louisiana. There she counseled recently freed slaves seeking to start businesses. In a speech she made later in life, Markham recalled telling clients, "Know your rights. If you don't, you'll lose them." To those who sought her advice, Markham seemed as wise as an oracle. Markham spent 20 years living in the South, helping people with their legal problems. She and her husband, Amos Markham, whom she met in law school and married in 1869, had 2 children, Hattie and Thomas. Markham never gave a reason for her sudden return to New York City in the mid-1890s. It is possible she simply missed her hometown. Turning point. After years of helping African American men understand and exercise their rights, Markham thought it was time to push for the vote for women. Before 1920, no American woman could vote in a presidential election, and Markham decided that women's suffrage, or right to vote, would become her primary cause. In 1905, Edith Markham participated in a march with hundreds of women in New York City. Suddenly, a line of angry men armed with bricks blocked their way. The marchers staggered to a halt, but Markham didn't waver. She leaped up onto a lamppost and spoke out in a clear voice. According to eyewitnesses, Markham ordered both sides to halt. The women stopped yelling and put down their signs, and the men dropped their bricks and left the scene. Edith Markham's calm call for order during the march impressed many people. She soon began a speaking career that lasted nearly 40 years. Markham's speaking engagements are too numerous to fully recount. She was in great demand in the United States and elsewhere. In 1907, she spoke at an important women's conference in Europe. She also made many visits to lawmakers in Washington, D.C. Finally, after years of Markham's and many others' hard work, the U.S. Congress ratified the 19th Amendment in 1920. It granted American women the right to vote. With her greatest crusade completed, Markham considered retirement, but worried it would be as dull as watching paint dry. Instead, she turned her attention to anti-war activities. When war broke out in Europe in 1939, Markham opposed U.S. involvement. By the end of World War II in 1945, Markham was 100 years old. She was too frail to attend rallies, but she wrote letters in support of the rights and freedoms of people everywhere. Her message of the need to preserve our freedoms is clear in the memoir she wrote in 1952. It was published the same year she died, at age 107. We have now reached the conclusion of this full text reading. Please return to your Google Classroom for further instructions. Element Gijigad, Minwa Bamapi.